Welcome to Intangibles podcast. I'm Steve BERG, your host. Success is driven by how as much as by what. How we communicate, how we lead, how we relate to our environment are all vitally important. Intangibles is a podcast that explores the underlying traits, qualities, and behaviors that improve the how. This is accomplished by finding the people who have studied and been successful practicing these soft skills and having informed conversations with them to get to what is learnable. Let's begin. The great artist Vincent van Gogh suffered from psychotic episodes and delusions. And though he worried about his mental stability, he often neglected his physical health, did not eat properly, and drank heavily. Van Gogh was unsuccessful during his lifetime and was considered a madman and a failure. With this in mind, I found it a little jarring when I ran across the following quote by him. "Let's not forget that the little emotions are the great captains of our lives, and we obey them without realizing it." It seems discontinent that a man so seemingly out of sync with the rest of the world could be so in tune with himself. Maybe his genius, which was only recognized after he died, was tied to his emotional intelligence and personal intelligence. I'm talking today with Dr. Jack Mayer, one of the earliest and most original thinkers and researchers on the topics of emotional intelligence and personal intelligence. Dr. Mayer is professor of psychology at the University of New Hampshire. He received his Ph.D. in psychology at Case Western Reserve University and was a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University. His 1990 article, Emotional Intelligence, with Dr. Peter Salovey, provided a foundation for research in the area, and they have published dozens of works in the area since, including the Mayer-Salovey-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test. In 2008, Dr. Mayer published an article that inquired whether there might exist a broader personal intelligence, focused on understanding our personalities, which led to further research and ultimately the book Personal Intelligence, The Power of Personality and How It Shapes Our Lives, which came out in February of 2014. Welcome, Dr. Mayer, to Intangibles Podcast. Thanks so much for coming on. Is there anything that you'd like to tell us about yourself before we begin?
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to talk with you, and I appreciate the introduction very much. I think that pretty much covers the waterfront.
Okay, fantastic. I always like to start with some definitions just to kind of set a baseline. In this case, I'll give you the definition, and maybe if you could provide more of the kind of significant detail or context, that would be like a helpful place to start.
Sounds good.
Good. So obviously, the first place we're going to go is emotional intelligence. And the definition is it involves the ability to perceive accurately, appraise, and express emotion, the ability to understand and utilize emotion and emotional knowledge, and the ability to regulate emotions to promote emotional and intellectual growth. So that's the clinical definition. The question is, how do you internalize the concept of emotional intelligence?
Oh my. Well, I think about, as you say, how do I think about it? I think about it as being sensitive to other people's physical and auditory, physical appearance and how they're sounding and how they're looking. I think about it as listening to their words and what they're saying and doing. And also extrapolating a little bit from the environment around them as to what their feeling states might be. So if I see somebody suddenly, if I'm conversing with somebody and I see them suddenly tense up, for example, I'll worry that I've trespassed or am in danger of raising some topic that they're very uncomfortable with. So that's the perceiving and appraising emotions. And then another part of the definition is utilizing emotions, and that involves knowing one's own emotion. So, for example, if I'm entering a situation and I know for some reason that I'm in an angry mood, then I'll try to remember to modulate what I'm doing so that that's not as much as possible. I keep that out of my interaction unless it's useful for some reason. Or if I'm sad, I'll know that I am perhaps perceiving things less accurate, well, not necessarily less accurately, but more negatively than other people. In terms of understanding, I think at times I like to liken emotions to pieces on a chessboard, because each emotion has its own moves, and those moves are unique to the pieces in the same way that a castle moves in one fashion and a knight on a chessboard moves in a very different fashion. Each emotion carries with it, it's got the word motion right in there, right in the emotion. Each emotion carries with it its own likely motions. Anger carries with it the potential for attack, fear for running, and so forth. And understanding those emotions and their implications, happiness for joining with others, is very, very helpful. And finally, regulation and management. Some people stress that above all the others. I like to view it as co-equal. Sometimes management means not managing your emotions, saying, the heck with it, I'm just gonna, I gotta relax. So that's kind of how I might elaborate on that definition.
I think that's perfect. I mean, the thing that, as I'm listening to you and kind of reacting to that, is it's an active pursuit, and awareness is so important, which, I mean, both of those things take a lot of energy, both mental energy and physical energy. This is not for wimps. This is a hard thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for some people it's fairly automatic, and for other people it's challenging, and sometimes the effort and the success are not correlated for some people. So some people are really good at it without much effort, and other people may take a lot of effort and still not be so good at it.
Yeah, I'm absolutely fascinated by that concept. I see it in my son all the time. He's got a very broad, even at 10 years old, of broad kind of emotional range, and I compare that to myself, and I just marvel. Like, not only was I not there at 10, I may not be there at 52. All right, let me.
I will add. I'm certainly no pro at it myself after all these years either.
It's hard. It's hard. Okay, I'm going to read the definition of personal intelligence, and we're gonna do the exact same exercise. So, personal intelligence involves understanding about personality, such that one can identify information about one's own and others' personality, model results of personality traits, let awareness of personality guide current choices, and plan based on understanding of personality. Again, that's kind of that's the compact version, but if you unpack it a little bit, that would be helpful.
Okay, again, I'll speak from as I envision it, as I think about it in terms of myself. That means coming to the table knowing that everybody else in the table is different. Some people are outgoing and sociable, other people not. Some people have a generally happy disposition, others less so. Some people can be trusted, others maybe less so. Other people are reliable, and so forth. And knowing those attributes in myself as well as I can. So that's identifying the information. And then putting it together in a model involves a kind of a complex package of putting together a person's, like, what's motivating the individual, what does the person want to accomplish, how well does that fit with their capabilities, how does do their customary socio-emotional traits, how outgoing they are, what their emotional style is, fits in with those motives and how they express it. And then lastly, whether their plans fit who they are. And of course, this is also self-referential. Are my plans realistic given my capacities and preferences for doing or not doing certain things in my life? So it's putting together everything as a package And if I might relate that back to emotional intelligence for a moment, emotional intelligence is I mean, I'm partial to it. I think it's a fabulous concept, but it only takes us so far because, for example, in managing emotion, a lot of how you decide ultimately to conduct yourself emotionally has to do with the broader personality package of who you are. Are you that, what is your overall framework? Is your framework to get along with everybody? Is your framework to achieve in life? Is your framework to create fabulous paintings? And all of that is going to be the envelope within which both personal intelligence is going to set that up and help guide you toward those aims ideally. And emotional intelligence takes place within that broader context. So knowing about both of them, they really work together to a considerable degree, I think.
So that makes sense to me. And I know you've talked about, all right, behavioral scientists broadly, I think, are coming to consensus that people have multiple intelligences. For example, you might have, as you mentioned, musical intelligence, or you might have spatial intelligence, or you might have social intelligence. I know you've articulated that as a Swiss Army knife. It was funny, when I was reading up on this, I immediately kind of harkened back to my old Dungeons and Dragons days and like creating a character with a 20-sided die, right? And if it had super high intelligence, then it would be a wizard. If it had super high strength, then it would be a warrior character. But it sounds to me like you're saying that based on your view, personal intelligence is it a subset of emotional intelligence, or is it a kind of a separate body that overlaps with them? Actually, maybe I just don't know. Maybe that's the question. How do you view them in context with each other?
Okay. So people are often surprised to learn that I'm a reasonably traditional. When I move into the intelligence field from personality psychology, which is really my home discipline, but when I go into the intelligence field, I'm actually a fairly traditional intelligence person. And right now there is a model that works really well in the field called the Cattell-Horn-Carroll model. And, well, I hope I have that right. It could be the Carroll-Horn-Cattell model, but the CHC model, or the three-stratum model. And what that does basically is it says that intelligence can be represented reasonably well with an organizational chart where you have a CEO, which is general intelligence, and then you have a whole bunch of VPs, vice presidents, or you like your chief financial officer or your chief operating officer, and so forth. And that second tier are the broad intelligence, so-called broad intelligences, like verbal reasoning, spatial intelligence, auditory intelligence has been proposed. And I view personal intelligence as part of that spectrum of broad intelligences, and also as emotional intelligence as part of that spectrum. And one of the ideas that we're toying around with now in our lab, although we still need a little bit more evidence to get to this point, is that personal intelligence and emotional intelligence are part of a spectrum of these intelligences, where some are very impersonal intelligences, like spatial intelligence and mathematical intelligence, and others are very person-centered intelligences, like emotional intelligence and personal intelligence. So for now, for the time being, given what we know, I would say that there's sort of two VPs under the CEO of general intelligence, and alongside a number of other alongside a number of other officers in the company who are doing important jobs.
So distinct, but they work together.
Distinct, but they work somewhat distinct. All of these, work together in the same company. They're all, in statistical terms, they all correlate with one another. So the higher you are in one, the more likely it is that you're higher in another. But it's not a lockstep kind of connection. It's probabilistic.
Right.
And I should mention, since I mentioned three tiers, that the third tier underneath these are specific very specific tasks that you can carry out, mental tasks that you can carry out.
I see. Okay. Now, so when I think about that, I'm just going to diverge for just a second based on what I heard. If I have certain strengths along that spectrum, which are going to be different than perhaps your strengths or others, in order to kind of maximize the way I relate to people, that will, I ought to be emphasizing certain behaviors, certain situations in which what I'm good at, what my emotional or personal intelligence strengths are, can best manifest themselves for my benefit and for the benefit of those that I'm interacting with. Do I have that right?
Yes, and I think one of the putting on my personality psychologist hat for a second, not everybody needs every strength or wants every strength or needs to have every strength. And I often use the example of engineers, versus supervisors in a very customer-friendly company. The engineers don't need necessarily to have a lot of personal or emotional intelligence. If they have that too, that's wonderful, and that's a real benefit. But on the other hand, if you are supervising a group of people and it's important, retention is important to you, and their good functioning is important to you, then having some of these people skills and understanding of the personalities around you can be enormously helpful, I think.
I agree. Okay. So if I were to, there's something that I really want to clear up, and you're the perfect person to do that. If I were to Google emotional intelligence, probably the top 4 or 5 articles that I see will say something to the effect that emotional intelligence competencies are more important than intelligence in predicting who's going to be successful. I think that's a conception. And I also think that it's probably a misconception. And I'm wondering, as kind of the original researcher here, if you could share your thoughts with regard to this.
Yes, my colleagues and I never said, did not say that. That came from that came from journalistic accounts of the intelligence, which were, which we don't want to argue. I mean, they created a lot of excitement around the conception, and we're delighted to see that.
But they were really sensationalized, weren't they?
Those claims were quite sensationalized. Yes, I think that our evidence shows that, and I'm trying to think of a good way to put this, that if you're going to play the odds in life, having these skills over time, and when I say these skills, I mean emotional intelligence or personal intelligence or any broad intelligence really, means that you're playing the odds, you're tilting, the gambling table slightly, or tilting the game slightly in your favor. And over time, that makes a huge amount of difference. So I use the analogy in that book, Personal Intelligence, that of a person who is just sort of a trivial example, like choosing who to go out to lunch with. If you've got higher personal intelligence, if you've got no personal intelligence and you're continually picking a very simplified situation, you're going to go out to lunch 100 times in the next 2 years, and you have 2 people to choose from, and you want to choose the person with whom you're going to have the most enjoyable time. If you've got no intelligence in this area, you're going to choose correctly 50% of the time. Statistically, if you have these intelligences, as we calculated out, maybe you can raise that a little bit to 55 or 60, or maybe if you're especially good at it, 65% of the time versus 35% of the time. So in every choice, you're not making a huge difference, and you're not assuring that you're correct. But over time and over meals and over more important decisions than who you're going out to lunch with, although that can be a very important decision, you're gonna just have an easier and more pleasant time of it if you can tilt the odds in your favor. And that's what these intelligences do. But any of them, all of them do that in different ways. Emotional and personal intelligence do that in the interpersonal sphere. Mathematical intelligence does it in the mathematics area. Spatial intelligence does it does it for architects who need to be very spatially sensitive to how things will look. Verbal intelligence does it for writers.
Mm-hmm. So you were good enough to expound on the definition of emotional intelligence with regard to the appraisal, utilization, regulation. If you wouldn't mind, I want to dig down just a little bit on those, and I have a question or two. Mm-hmm. So first, appraisal, and these questions get to how we can do better. So my question regarding appraisal is, how do people take inventory of what they're feeling, especially in a time when they feel many things at the same time? It seems very hard to kind of understand your state of the state.
Gosh, that's a great question, and I think I kind of come to the paradox that is now often discussed in psychology, which is that if you're low skill in an area, you kind of don't know what you're missing, and you kind of may not know where to go in order to sort things out. If you're high skill in the area, I think what you're able to do is to over time tease out the threads of what you're feeling, like if you're feeling many different things at the same time. And I should say here, if it's important enough, kind of analyze each thread. And I think if it is important enough, it's often with an idea of managing it and say, well, okay, this one makes me feel rather anxious. I can put this one aside for now. This one makes me feel really delighted for the other person. This will help me in an interpersonal interaction with them. This thread makes me feel, is my feeling of envy. I wish that had happened to me. Well, tough beans. It didn't happen this time, but maybe it will happen next time. Mm-hmm. For now, I got to enjoy the success on behalf of this other person. Or maybe I can't do that, and so I've got to look for some other coping strategy. So I think it requires a lot of reflection and analysis of your feelings in order to, and coping, because I think usually we don't engage in this just for the sake of, twiddling our thumbs or navel gazing. Usually we want to get someplace by doing it. And it's tough. And then also, again, going to the broader personal intelligence, or maybe this is more just generally being psychologically minded. Am I feeling bad because I'm just low on sleep? I didn't eat well today. I missed my morning workout. Can any of that help?
Yeah, I totally think about oftentimes if I worked late the night before, or I did something that took my time and attention, do I need to kind of mentally compensate for that in terms of how I interact with people, like the next day, right? Am I short on something that's causing the improper reaction?
Right. Yep.
Okay. Continuing on appraisal with regard to empathy. So that's the ability to comprehend another person's feelings. And I would go as far as to say almost re-experience those feelings oneself. And I know that being empathetic is a highly endearing quality to the point of being magnetic. I mean, people gravitate toward those that are empathetic toward them. Certainly, not hard to see why. Because you always end up feeling good around an empathetic person. The question, though, is how can we inventory the weaknesses around the skill set of empathy, and how can we build our ability to be more empathetic? Or can we? I mean, is it genetic, or can we actually do things in practice to become more empathetic?
Well, I guess, again, this comes to, I'm going to go into a personal intelligence direction here and say one of the things that's personal intelligence is really good for is trying to figure out one's own attributes. And so one way of doing this, but it will not work for everybody in every relationship. And again, it helps to start at a reasonably high level, because if you're at a low level, it's hard to know that. But if you're at a moderate, let's say middle to higher level of these, and by the way, many people are at middle to higher levels. We find in our laboratory that these qualities are not normally distributed, that they are slightly skewed so that more people are medium to high than are low. But to find out, how good you are at something requires having trustworthy relationships with other people and being able to ask them, do you experience me as empathic? Why or why not? Or when? How could I be, and if you don't experience me as empathic, was there at least one time where I expressed some empathy? And then go back to that moment and figure out how you can build your skills to bring that one time, make that more than one time.
Yeah. So find a data point, analyze the data point, see if you can recreate it.
Yes, but I think it requires other people, right? Because you can't see your own empathy. You cannot feel your own empathy toward another person. Only other people can perceive that. And so you have to be able to pick somebody. You have to have somebody in your orbit who is a trustworthy perceiver, or more than one person in your orbit who are trustworthy perceivers, and have a trusting enough relationship with them so that they can give you so that they are willing to give you meaningful feedback without retribution from you. And having confidence that you're not going to fall apart if they tell you, well, you got a lot of strengths. Empathy ain't one of them. You got to be able to hear that if you are able to hear it, and then figure out, like I said, maybe there are one or two places where you did show empathy, and you can build on those. Know how those moments were different and what you can do to build from those. It's not easy.
Yeah, I can tell you there's probably a lot of people out there right now that are just cringing at the thought of asking somebody to analyze their level of empathy.
Right.
Certainly, I would be at the front of that line.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it analyzing, but just have you experienced me caring about you, or have you experienced me correctly understanding?
Nope, not at all.
Right. Am I correctly understanding how you're feeling? And most of us actually checking that's often a good idea, because no matter how accurate we are, or rather, no matter how accurate we are capable of being, the people who are perceiving are also extremely complex. And they're going to often surprise us, no matter how good we are, by saying, no, actually, you're completely off the mark today. I'm not feeling sad. I just didn't have any sleep last night. I'm actually in a good mood, but I'm really tired. Or I'm not feeling well, but I'm in a reasonably good mood. Or I'm not in a good mood. No, you missed that entirely. I'm actually feeling pretty rotten. And so people will surprise us. Asking is a really good way of finding out how accurate. That's another way of finding out how accurate we are, without necessarily asking how accurate we are, but just saying, I'm under the impression that something's wrong today. Am I mistaken?
All right. Noted. Sadly. I'm going to move on to utilization. Just a question or two there.
Yeah.
This one I find kind of in my wheelhouse as a venture capitalist and a person who works with entrepreneurs who are trying to influence others to do something that may be out of the ordinary. So, let's say that I want to convince someone to take a chance of something. Maybe it's, we're going to leave a safe job for a startup or take less money now for the promise of more money later. How can I regulate emotions in others so that they may be more open or clear-minded to an opportunity that I might be presenting? So in other words, how does emotional intelligence impact the ability to motivate?
Well, Steve, I think you know a lot more about these decisions and managerial and planning decisions than I do. You're the expert there. I would imagine that you're looking at a complex set of variables in trying to make that decision. And some of that's going to pull in a lot of personal intelligence as well as emotional intelligence, because now we're talking about goals and motivation. And that's more in the wheelhouse, and planning. And that's more in the wheelhouse of personal intelligence, sort of looking at the arc of one's life. And I bet when you do that, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that you're considering the person's skill level, age, the issue of, that is to say, if they're young and they have, more time to fail, maybe. You're considering the quality of the idea. You're considering the marketplace. This goes beyond even personal intelligence, right? Except that, well, let me qualify that. One of the key lessons that I've learned about personal intelligence is, I think when I was younger and I became, I was very enthusiastic about psychology when I entered the field. That was very helpful to me, to be perhaps blindly enthusiastic about it. And as I've worked more and more in personality psychology, I've increasingly said, a person, an individual personality, is a weak system by itself. By which I mean that each of us is embedded in a wider social context and a series of situations, and we cannot control all of them. So we're always in a situations where we're taking gambles. And so depending on your life, you have to think through your life plan. We all have to think through our life plan, and how many gambles, how risky are we willing to be? How many risks are we willing to take? And how important is it to us to meet a goal, whatever goal it is, whether it's creating, whether the venture is to create a more socially responsible world, or to improve a tech feature that's been driving us crazy and we think we can fix, or make money, or whatever it is that our goal is, whatever it is that's a person's goal. How much are we willing to risk for that, and how much confidence do we have in the idea? As somebody who watches these enterprises develop over and over again, I'm going to appeal, if I may, take a brief detour to another theory of intelligence proposed by my colleague Philip Ackerman, and he talks about adult intelligences that develop specifically in adulthood, which include areas of expertise. For example, in your case, you've seen, I would imagine, many businesses take off and either flourish or fail. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we call it, we've even got a nickname for it. It's muscle memory, right? Pattern recognition. Like, oh, I've seen that 3 times before. I know the next step in that. I think you're exactly right. And I can almost feel where you're going here based on exactly like what you're trying to walk me through. Absolutely. We see these patterns over time as I've gotten older. I couldn't have done it when I was 23. But much better now, into my late 40s and early 50s.
Okay. So one of the interpersonal levers that you have as you're talking to managers naturally is this capacity, is this experience level that you already have acquired in seeing many of these things happen. And so in that regard, you can offer, again, this comes back to this personality as weak system is probably a bad way of putting it in this case, but a dependent system. Each of us is dependent upon the people and the environments around us to a greater or lesser degree. And if I'm starting a company, I'm going to be dependent upon, I may be dependent upon my investors to guide me into, and I want to be able to trust them to try to guide me as best they can. Just like if I'm a graduate student, I want my faculty advisor to guide me as best they can in my research and so forth. And each of us has people who we trust to guide us or provide some guidance, or if we're lucky, we have somebody in our orbit who we can trust to guide us a little bit in different areas. And maybe not everybody is, going to guide us all in all the areas, but we've got our doctors to guide us medically, and we've got our specialists to guide us in different areas.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the reasons that I do Intangibles podcast and study things like, grit or intellectual honesty or emotional intelligence is for that very reason, to, be able to talk to folks like you who really are down in the weeds in it and understand the nitty gritty, so that I can put more kind of tools into my toolbox, more pattern recognition for both, one, being able to recognize in advance before an investment in a founder, but then two, once that founder becomes part of my investment family, part of my portfolio, exactly what you're saying, to provide a little guidance based on some behavioral psychology, some knowledge, some statistics about how these things come together successfully most often.
Right. I think it's sort of like when I introduce a new theory or in psychology, I know that, or I suspect. Well, the first thing I know is I can't know anything about it. Is that every time I do something, it's going to be new. But I have some experience in understanding that there's a certain germination period, that there's going to be a second phase of I hope successful research in the area if the idea is viable, and then ultimately people will start paying attention to it. And so I've learned to identify those phases and to be patient with them and to understand that ongoing process. And I think serial founders probably themselves have built up some of that experience. But if you're a founder of a business at the very start, and this is the beginning of your career, you probably don't have so much experience in that area, and having a little bit of guidance might be quite reassuring.
And that's why talking to you is perfect. So look, you said something. I'm going to jump forward into the question that I had for you that I was kind of saving toward the end. But you said something really interesting about focus on the future shape of your life. Mm-hmm. And I recall that, well, let me give an example first. So for example, people may save money if their expectation of the future shape of their life is to be wealthy, or they may,
or they just want security,
or security, right? They may focus on education for the purpose of stability. They may focus on family if the personal interaction and love are the high. So there were two stories that when I was reading your research, oddly, they were both tied to Clay Christensen. And this is in your book about personal intelligence. Either I can relate those stories and you can comment, or you can relate those stories. Take your pick.
Well, go ahead and if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Okay.
So the very first story, this is during the time when Mr. Christensen is a Rhodes Scholar. And, he's struggling, and he knows that he needs every ounce, every second that he has to study for this. But he makes a conscious choice after a couple months in that he was going to spend 1 hour per night figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. And taking away from that time, which was absolutely precious to him. And ultimately, we know how it worked out. A long, distinguished career, amazing contribution to society. But he has talked about the fact that this was the single most useful thing that he ever did or learned, was taking that time to decide what he wanted to do with his life.
Yes, I think that's it's a heroic story, and I take it at its face value, but I'm not sure everybody is capable of doing that. I do think it's very, very important to figure out what you would like to do with your life. Some of us know, from the start what it is that we want to do, or we feel our way into it. David Brooks has a remarkable column on that very story where he says, most young adults can't sit down for an hour a night and figure that out. For them, good life development is much more a matter of interacting with the environment and learning from the environment. And I don't think I don't think he's trying to take away from Dr. Christensen either. He is, they're both saying, look, this was right for him.
Yeah.
I think there's a certain degree at which we need to step back and say there's sort of a personalized medicine. It's like personalized medicine.
Okay.
Some people digest cholesterol through their diet, or could add to their cholesterol by eating eggs. For other people, they eat eggs and the cholesterol does not get absorbed or into their bloodstream. And so it helps to know which group you're a member of, because in one group you can eat all the eggs you like, and in the other you have to watch it. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's a ready test for that for most of us. But same thing for personalities. So I think that really worked for him. It is heroic, it's fabulous, but it's not going to work for everybody.
Okay.
But I'm curious. That's plainly stuck in your mind. What do you make of it?
Well, what I make of it is that at the very least, you should understand which direction you're rowing, right? Because you're going to have choices that come to you along your path in your lifetime. And, it'll be difficult for you to decide between two things or three things or four things at every given moment. But if you've decided kind of where it is that you would ultimately want to end up, making those decisions in a coherent, kind of consistent way will be much easier.
Okay, so I think that's a great point. And I think that many of us, if we're fortunate, we are given choices in life regarding, for example, the direction of our careers or certainly the direction of our families and so forth. And there come times when those decisions, where we really have to sit and go, who am I? Mm-hmm. And, these are both great choices or both miserable choices. But hopefully, let's use the example of two great choices. Do I continue at the firm I'm at the company I'm at, and I'm doing well here, or at the university I'm at, and I'm doing well here? Or do I take a gamble and do something rather different than I've been doing in the past? Do I continue researching in one area or trying a new area? Do I found this new company, or do I backtrack and go back to work elsewhere? Those are great moments when taking a few days or weeks or months or however long it takes to really think through one's priorities and match who one is to what's right to do becomes crucial. Because if the decisions looked at apart from the person, there's often no answer to that question.
Yeah.
That is to say, they're both great alternatives. So the only way to answer it is what's going to make you happier or more fulfilled as which direction, which choice is going to make you more fulfilled as a person. And if we're lucky, we are confronted with those choices. And if we're doubly lucky, we know enough about who we are so that we can say, you know, I'm not a risk taker.
Right.
This is not right for me.
Right.
Or I love taking risks. I'm willing to fail, and I'm hopeful I'm going to succeed. I think there's a reasonable chance of success here. I can live with it either way, and I'm going to find that more exciting.
So you just completely set up the second Clay Christensen story. And that story revolves around his return to Harvard and a class reunion. And he's looking around the room and he notices that his classmates were, quote, unhappy, divorced, and alienated from their children. And he notes that the people that were there, of course, didn't set those goals to achieve those outcomes. They weren't, like, hey, when I grow up, I'm going to be unhappy and divorced. And so the notion there is that, this is the other side of the coin, as opposed to where you're going, where you should not be going. Because what you need to do is you need to say, hey, I emphasize happiness and I should do things, plan things in my life that will make me happy. I value not being divorced after 7 years of marriage. I need to work at that. So by the way, I think that, bringing it full circle to emotional intelligence and personal intelligence, this is where you bring to bear those skill sets. What say you?
I'm gonna agree. I'm gonna say that I'm gonna go back to that idea of personality being contingent on a lot of things, and that particular Harvard generation that Christensen was part of was a generation that did not particularly emphasize or think a lot about interpersonal relationships. It was a very competitive, impersonal sort of there was a lot of emphasis on objectivity. Objectivity was considered extremely, and impartiality was considered extremely important. And there was less emphasis, I think, when he came up on interpersonal skills. I've seen sort of an echo of this in medical school training, or what some administrators have expressed concern about in medical school training, not so much now, but in the 1990s and early 2000s, where deans of medical schools said, we've been training these physicians to be excellent diagnosticians and excellent practitioners, but we neglected bedside manner. And now we're hearing complaints from our patients that the doctors don't have that interpersonal caring that doctors often had in the past. What have we lost by emphasizing test scores on the MCATs, where there may not be a lot of questions about understanding people, only about understanding biology and physiology and materials like that, or whatever standardized tests they're using, are not drawing on those emotional or personal spheres.
Yeah, not enough classes on bedside manner.
Right. And so what kinds of classes do you need? And here I'll go back to Philip Ackerman's work in adult intelligence, adult intelligences and adult areas of expertise. What kind of classes do you need to start laying down and saying, these are some of the principles of how personality works? Knowing some of these principles, does that help you plan out maybe, or does that help you identify some of your own characteristics? And can you kind of plan out a little bit of who you want to be in the future? More so perhaps than those classmates, Harvard classmates who didn't fare so well in every realm. Although I hasten to add that, again, no matter how good one is at these things, just like no matter how good a founder of a company may be, failure can be a part of life.
Right. It's hard. It's going to be hard.
It's hard.
Right. Yeah. So we took a huge kind of detour there. I'm going to bring us back and kind of shorten us up for the home stretch here.
Okay.
We had talked about appraisal, then we talked about utilization, and I have a question or two about regulation, and then I'm going to wind down and we'll call it a day. But with regard to regulation, I'm thinking about people keeping their cool, right? Especially under pressure. The people that what's that quote about? If you can keep your head, well, those about you are losing it. How do we regulate our emotions so we are composed specifically when it matters?
Yeah, that's a really key question, and I think the first element of that, maybe there's a preceding step, which is, when do we need to control our emotions? Because it's not necessarily all the time, although it doesn't, if we could, that would be lovely. First of all, for some of us, it's pretty easy because if we're easygoing and pleasantly, mild-mannered and pleasant, even happy-go-lucky, it's not going to be such a hard job. But for those of us who are there was a famous 20th century diagnostician named Paul Meehl, who referred to people as born 3 drinks behind. For those of us,
you know exactly what he means by that.
Yeah, for those of us who may have been born 1, 2, or 3, or even 4 drinks behind, sometimes that self-control can always be very, very challenging. And so I think we begin by using a little personal intelligence and acknowledging, hey, we're all in different spots in this. For some of us, self-control really isn't very hard. They're not really self-controlling. They're just on autopilot. Everything's cool much of the time. So no big deal for them. Others of us have a harder path to tread. And there are multiple ways to self-control. The one I like the least for most of the time is blocking out, but I use it even though I recognize that it can be problematic. The reason I don't like blocking things out or isolating them or denying them is because you're cutting off information sources. So if you're saying I'm never angry or I'm never I'm not afraid or whatever, when in fact you are, that can reduce your understanding of yourself and your situation in ways which over the long term are not helpful. But like I said, I use it from time to time. But then there are other means. There are forms of meditation one can use. I try to, I use an example that one of my academic colleagues, Arlie Hochschild, reported on when she was looking at self-control techniques taught to Delta flight attendants, actually, where they were told to imagine that a particularly difficult passenger on an air flight was having a bad day or didn't get enough sleep or that there was something going wrong in their life. And I try to imaginatively put myself in somebody else's spot who I might find annoying at the moment and say, maybe they've had some kind of a bad day or going through a rough period. So I'm going to give them a pass on this.
My partner often uses the expression, don't assign to malice what you can attach to ignorance. So he mentally gives somebody, he's like, oh, they just don't know. And that makes him feel better whether it's true or not.
Yep. And then there's also the self-referential matter of, hey, I've been under a lot of pressure myself the last 2 or 3 months. I may be overreacting. It's quite likely I'm overreacting to what's going on. Let me check with the person. Yeah. Did they mean to do what they did, or would they be willing to do whatever they did differently?
Mm-hmm. Right. All right. So there's what I call the gauntlet, which is like just 3 quick questions at the end, but we've got one more question that I want to ask before we get to that. And I think, frankly, this is an anecdotal question. Again, I'm going to let you beg out of this in the event that you can't remember the details, because it was at least 5 years ago, if not more. But if you care to comment, or if you can remember anything, love your thoughts. So sometime right around 2014, maybe a little bit before, you made a personal study or a study of personal intelligence with the following folks. Oprah Winfrey was one, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, the big ones here, clearly, Charles Schwab, Martha Stewart, Donald Trump, Jack Welch. And you looked at each of these folks and you actually ranked them as, in terms, yes. Personal
intelligence, yeah.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
One of our first attempts, actually, I think the article is a little bit before that, but it was one of our first attempts at trying to measure the skill, trying to show that there were consistent individual differences in it. Yeah.
So Oprah won. She was ranked the highest, and she was the most self-aware, and the most contextually aware, and also, and then finally, you said something about her being the most intellectually honest, assuming with herself. Do you remember? If you do, if you don't, that's just fine. Who else was at the top? Who was at the bottom?
Okay, well, I can surely remember Oprah and some of the things that placed her at the top, which is not I recognize is not exactly what you're asking. I'd rather not talk about the people at the bottom.
Fair enough.
Oprah, and I should also say as a proviso that a few years later, I was kind of this study has really stuck with me for a while. And a few years later, I wrote a paper with a colleague of mine here at the University of New Hampshire, and on the ethics of evaluating public figures. And one of the things that we uncovered at that time was that, which I hadn't known at the time I was writing this, is of course all these people are surrounded by various publicists who can shape their public persona. So I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, there can be spin happening, and frankly, all you have to do is look at that list to know that some people have been handled very well.
But let's treat it as take it at face value what they said about themselves. And my colleague here, by the way, is Michelle Leishman, with whom I co-wrote this article on the ethics of evaluating people's personality at a distance. What was striking about Oprah, and goes beyond anything I could do, I think, is her willingness and her agility and ability to be out there, to have a public identity, which I can only guess, I hope I'm not mistaken here, I don't think I'm mistaken, is pretty integral, a pretty honest representation of her inner identity. So she brings her inner identity out as in her public persona, and she as she says herself, and I think we quote in that article, she never forgets who she is, and what her background was, and how she was brought up, and the things that have happened to her. And she uses that, and in fact, this is one of those ideas of using understanding one's personality to guide choices. She can use those facets of her own development, of the sometimes very challenging situations that she faced, and other times the very joyous situations that she faced. She can use those challenging and joyous past personal experiences to understand something of what other people have been through, and to bring them out, and to bring out their trust in her.
Mm-hmm. So I think what you're saying there, she was the most authentic, and people related to that authenticity most strongly on a relative basis to other people who are, fairly authentic. I would say, for example, that Jack Welch, seems like a fairly authentic guy, but yet still the warmness of Oprah Winfrey is what people would gravitate to.
A lot of these other leaders who were low personal intelligence, we make the point in the article, were very, very good leaders.
Right.
But they were sort of task-focused leaders. Somebody like Steve Jobs was really focused on getting out a fabulous, aesthetically rewarding product. And it's in its own way, that's interpersonal. He wanted us all to go, oh, that's pretty, or that's elegant.
Right.
But it's once removed from the interpersonal relationship, whereas Oprah is not once, I imagine she is to some degree, but she's much more directly connected with people,
yeah.
I would say.
I'm going to link it back to Vincent van Gogh from the beginning, right? I mean, like he related, it seemed like it was completely discontinent from those around him, but yet he was so personally in tune. And I think what you're saying about Jobs is like he understood what people wanted, right? And in giving that to them, they felt a personal connection to him.
Yeah, but it's through things rather than through the direct interpersonal connection. And that's fabulous. We have to have both kinds of people in the world. But it's a very, very different approach, and it helps to know which kind of person you are.
All right. So look, we're down to the last three. These are kind of rapid fire. The first question I always ask is there anything that I didn't bring into the conversation that you think is important to talk about? And I'll tell you that I'm looking at my notes here, and there's probably at least a third of the questions that I intended to ask that I didn't get to because, we just had such a good conversation.
It's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. We could go on forever.
I think that's right.
Let's put that one. Let's just say, of course, this could go on forever. But maybe we'll go on to the next one.
We'll go. Yeah, we'll save that. We'll save your idea of what we want to for the next time we talk.
Okay.
So question number 2, besides the books and papers that I referenced in your bio, any specific resources that people who are interested in this topic you think should go find?
If you're interested in personal intelligence or emotional intelligence and you're up for looking at a little bit of the scientific research more directly, you can come to if you just Google the Personality Lab at the University of New Hampshire, you'll come to 2 of our sites. One is a library website, which has a bunch of documents from the lab, and the other is our lab website itself, which has some brief introductions to these things and some links to books and resources and so forth.
Yeah, I was hoping you would say that. In doing this, oftentimes I'll have someone come on and I'm like, oh, you read the book. When you came on, not only was it multiple books, but it was multiple scientific or collegiate documents. The density of the material that you have out there is mind blowing. Okay, final question.
Yes.
I think that people don't necessarily know that you are kind of the underpinning of this. You're one of the original researchers, kind of the original. When you put out new things, where can people who want to find you or follow your work go?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I would say our university website is the best place to go. Our websites, I should say, since we have those 2. I try to keep those. My students and I try to keep those fairly up to date. They don't always have the latest cutting edge stuff, but we've got some 2019 stuff up there already, and we do try to keep that pretty accessible to people.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Mayer, that's it.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you, Steve. Thanks for making it such an enjoyable and interesting experience.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's a complex topic. I think we can agree on that. And having you help us sort through it, immensely valuable. Really appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome.
This has been Intangibles. You can find this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and many other podcast platforms. You can also find it at its home on the web, which is www.intangiblespodcast.com. I'm Steve BERG. Thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode.